My name is Dr. Maurice Westhuizen, member of faculty at GIBS. Our special guests today, let me quickly introduce them. First of all, Tsepo Dema. Tsepo has worked for Eskom for 11 years, was a management consultant for the final 2.5 years, advising the board, the C-suite executives on the current state of affairs in the energy sector. In 2018, he did his MBA, interestingly, on the topic of Eskom, too big to fail or necessitated change. And so wealth of experience and insight. More recently, he holds the position of head of business intelligence, which is a startup in the clean energy space called Home Energy. And so speaking to us not only from an Eskom perspective, but also a renewable energy perspective, building on his research in his MBA. Our second guest today is Matthew Cruz. Matthew is a solar energy expert. He heads up business intelligence. In fact, I had spoken in error. Matthew is in fact with Horn Energy, and so let me correct that, and works across the renewable energy space, and so great to have him with us. Also an MBA graduate, lots of experience in the energy sector. And so with that, colleagues, let me welcome you. Looking forward to a robust discussion. And I'm going to start by giving our panelists each an opportunity to share for a few minutes on your perspective on the energy crisis, the state of energy in South Africa. And then we'll take some time to unpack the governance, the energy mix, the policy issues. And so if I could start with you, Tsepo, if you can give us a perspective on where you think the energy sector is at, why are we in the mess we're in? And then we'll come to Matthew. Go ahead, Tsepo.
Well, Dr. Marius, thank you very much for the kind invitation to this GIBS forum. I understand it's the first one for the calendar year 2023. So it's an honor to be here. And I think for the many, many delegates that have signed in to really be a part of this discussion, a very important discussion. We are very grateful that we can be able to share some ideas. And very briefly, I think the question is, well, what defines a crisis? And a crisis is a very intensely difficult situation that requires equally a very urgent action. And that's, I think, an apt description of where we are in the country, not only in terms of electricity, but in terms of energy. But I think for the purposes of today, we will focus more on the electricity aspect of it. And really to be able to understand what led us to be where we are, I think one has to really very briefly look back in history to be able to understand, therefore, where we might be going. And what is that history? The history, I think, has been that for any country, for any sovereign state, the understanding is that energy security is state security and sovereignty, because energy forms the foundation from which everything, what's the socio-economic aspects are founded on. And when you read the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, in fact, for us to be able to enjoy any of the fundamental rights promised to us in the Constitution of the Republic, you cannot do that when you are energy insecure, when you've got energy poverty. And it's with that understanding that we then say, what would be the most appropriate and efficacious way to ensure energy security, to eradicate energy poverty in order for the socio-economic aspects that I'm referring to, for them to be realized, or rather those rights to be realized. And therefore, it means that the type of an energy policy that you formulate as a country has to be anchored on 3 pillars. And those 3 pillars are effectively, in the first and foremost, for the country with the geographical spread of South Africa, with the architecture of the economy, the manner in which it is, it means that you get directed to having constant, reliable, dispatchable energy that is to be able to ensure that you therefore can be able to achieve security. So that is the one pillar. The second pillar is that it must be so in the most cost-effective manner. You must be the least cost or competitively priced, because when energy costs go up, therefore you lose economic competitiveness, but also you will inadvertently end up with the rights of citizens being impeded, whether it's healthcare, education, safety and security, all of that. So therefore, the price is a very critical pillar in ensuring energy security. And thirdly, because of the world where we live in today, and our country being a member state of the multilateral institutions, whether the United Nations, the African Union, and many others, you then have to answer the issue of the environment, which means that you must have energy security, but that energy must be supplied in the least cost manner possible, and it must be done in an environmentally sustainable manner. So when you look in terms of where we are as a country, and going back to the days of Dr. Hendrik van der Bijl, who founded Eskom, and Eskom, which is celebrating 100 years in just a few days from now, on the 1st of March, you then have to understand that people like Dr. Hendrik van der Bijl were inspired by what they saw happen in the United States. That when the United States really had the architecture of their energy, and specifically with the grid the way that it was, they were able to achieve economic growth that is sustainable. Hence, America is the largest economy globally. But at the same time, they were able to increase the life expectancy for their people. And hence, therefore, with that in mind, they brought us the system that we have. But understanding the geographical spread of the country and the energy sources that could enable us to achieve energy security constantly available, it is therefore no surprise that Eskom has been structured in the manner that it is as the most integrated utility in the world. But when you look at also in terms of then the successive legislation that ensured that we could have energy security, specifically in this instance, I will just briefly refer to the Eskom Conversion Act of 2001, and specifically Section 6, subsection 5, A and B of that. And I think the delegates to this forum can be able to refer to it at a particular time. But it is therefore not surprising that the erstwhile chair and CEO of Eskom, both in terms of Dr. Ruel Khoza and Mr. Alan Morgan, they then wrote a book called The Symphony of Power, because that came with the understanding that based on these three pillars I've referred to, which are very fundamental to energy security, which is state security and sovereignty, then that in South Africa, you need a symphony, that everything else, the moment it is out of harmony, it is out of tune, you end up with the problems that we have. But we are not good students of history, and particularly in terms of the policymakers, that from around 2011, 2012, we then saw a departure from that which was, I would codename it, the Symphony of Power policy. And that unfortunately then brought us to the level where we are, where we then took erroneous policy decision. Very briefly, and I know that Matthew is going to refer to this in his own presentation and submission, but effectively, we needed to have a combination in terms of South Africa of knowing what we know, and based on the replete resources, natural resources, specifically in terms of coal, which can also be gasified, by the way, to then be able to provide energy and electricity specifically. Then you found that when we departed or thought that we no longer have got the capacity, which was an error, because South Africa has been a pioneer on many fronts, whether you're talking about coal to liquids, gas to liquids. We therefore meant that we could have continued in that trajectory of ensuring that we employ higher efficiency, lower emissions, clean coal technologies based on the vast coal resources that we have as a nation, to ensure that the grid, as it currently stands, it is not imperiled, but we can continue to hold that competitive advantage as the least cost producer, therefore attract investment in the bricks and mortar industries, but as well as in the new industries, all of which are energy intensive. And at the same time, in terms of the combination, the other leg, of course, would be that all of the intermittent energy sources would have been best off grid, taking into account the development of our country. And we would have achieved both worlds, because on the one hand, notwithstanding that we are a least cost, we are a least emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, we should have been able to continue to be the least emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. So very briefly, that would be my submission.
And Tsepo, you've touched on a number of issues, and you've made a very compelling case for what in the World Energy Council we would refer to as the energy trilemma, right? The need for energy security, energy equity, energy sustainability. It's a triangle, it's a trilemma. And you've made a very compelling case. And listening to you, the possibilities for competitiveness, I feel like I want to find out, where is this country with all this resource and all this amazing energy supply, as I sit here with my solar backup system, wondering why we didn't get it right. And you did talk about 2011, 2012, we departed from this, what did you call it, the policy, the power policy that would have created this balanced environment. So we're going to come back to some of those questions, and we're going to unpack them together. Looking forward to doing that. Matthew, you've listened to Tsepo, your perspective on the mess we're in. Are we in a mess? What's going on?
Great. So thank you very much to my esteemed colleague, panelist Tsepo, for giving us a brilliant view about how we've got here, where we're at the moment. I've actually prepared a short little presentation on the load shedding 5-year projection, because that kind of encapsulates what's going to happen going forward and the current state of things. You don't mind me just sharing that?
Like Matthew dropped off there for a second. He's going to rejoin, and we're going to go straight into his presentation. Tsepo, in a short sentence, you mentioned this pivotal point, 2011, 2012, where we changed direction as a country in terms of energy policy and orchestrating this balanced system. What happened? Why did we change direction? What do you put that down to?
Well, the basic error that was committed by the policymakers and the government was to insist on putting intermittent energy sources onto a grid, a high voltage grid, when we do not have the flexibility in terms of backup, which European nations have, specifically arising out of gas.
So that's very interesting. And you're touching on the energy mix and the infrastructure, the capabilities at the base level. And so we're going to come back to that. I'm going to question and challenge and explore that a little bit with you. I think Matthew's ready to share. Matthew, please go ahead.
Great. Sincere apologies for that technical interruption. I just needed to give some permissions to Zoom US to record everything that I'm doing. So just going to present quickly the 5-year load shedding projection and potential solution. And quick poll, no need to answer or put into the chat your opinion, but just think to yourself, where do you think we landed last year compared to the year before in terms of load shedding? Do we think that load shedding doubled? Do you think it tripled, quadrupled, or quintupled? That's just for yourself to think about. And then question number 2, over the next 5 years, your opinion, will load shedding halve, stay the same, or double? And hopefully by the end of this presentation, I'll have answered both these questions and we'll have a better fact-based view on the projection of the load shedding going forward. Great. So this is a slide that I presented in May to a media roundtable where there was 8 representatives from media houses like Daily Maverick, Business Tech, and White Broadband. And I basically just said to them, listen, load shedding and the price of electricity are projected to both double over the next 5 years. This was in May, and I was giving a medium-term projection, and the focus of that was mostly on the oldest coal power stations that are coming offline. Indrina, Camden, Honor power stations, for example, represents 8,000 megawatts that is going to be decommissioned over the next 5 years. Since then, we've already seen Komati be decommissioned, and that was the focus for why we're going to have load shedding doubling, the key reason. Also pointed out that the plans of the government at the time in window 5 and 6 are going to be wholly insufficient. As my esteemed colleague Tsepo pointed out, it's intermittent energy that is being planned by the government to be put onto the grid, and there was no discussion about them talking about coal, talking about rapidly deployable gas, any kind of carbon emitting technologies. There was nothing. So nothing that can really provide the peak demand, which is happening in the evening and the mornings. So because of this, I projected that load shedding was going to double. In May, this is the information that we had. It was quite a quiet year, so things hadn't really happened yet. And this is information from Eskom Push on the number of hours of load shedding that we've had in each year. And this is what we saw by January. 2023 in terms of the hours of load shedding that we experienced. So we had an overall tripling of the number of hours of load shedding between last year and the year before, which is very concerning. So in terms of a breakout year, we've already had our breakout year. I don't like hours of load shedding being the measurement for how we measure load shedding, because it only encapsulates the duration of time, but not the severity of the impact on South Africa. So for example, on this graph, 24 hours of load shedding of stage 6 will be represented the same as 24 hours of stage 1. But we all know it's very different in terms of the impact on the economy, a day-long period of load shedding stage 6. So I much prefer measuring in gigawatt hours, which is basically just taking the number of hours that we have had a certain stage of load shedding and multiplying it by the stage, because each stage of load shedding is 1,000 megawatts that's not serviced on the grid, or one gigawatt. So when we look at that information, and this is what we saw from CSR at the time, there had been increasing load shedding, but if we had to just think about this and track the years between 2019 and 2021, there was some increasing load shedding that took place, pretty much like a doubling. And to keep track of the years, I've just put little icons here of a single plane and a passenger plane and a Boeing 747. And when we look at what information came in the middle of last year in terms of gigawatt hours from CSR, we noticed that it was really going exponential or parabolic, as some may say in the finance terms. And we're seeing pretty much a rocket ship year last year. And this is from the middle of the year. That's because stage 6 really impacts the gigawatt hours that are being shed. So there's no new information coming out of CSR regarding this. I went and did the analysis myself. I downloaded the data. It's freely publicly available on Eskom's push. It's the last link at the bottom of the page. You can get a CSV or Excel download that shows you the number of hours that we've been had stages of load shedding and the states that we were in. And when we do the calculations, we see that overall, last year compared to the year before, we had a 4.7 times increase, or pretty much a quintupling of the overall energy that was removed from the grid and not serviced and not provided last year. And yeah, this is very concerning, because we've had basically a constant trend up until last year, and then we had a massive breakout year last year. What's even more concerning in my perspective is that in January, we see actually, in terms of gigawatt hours, more gigawatt hours shed in January alone as compared to 2021. That's very concerning, because it means over a 12-month period, we've had roughly then a 12 times increase in the overall amount of energy that isn't provided to South Africa. And that's a multiplier for every single month in the year. So that's very concerning information. In terms of the forward-looking perspective of what's going to happen in the next 5 years, we received some new information during the year. This is in November. We received confirmation that the power stations are indeed closing down. We have taken money from the World Bank, from Europe, confirming that we're going to close these power stations. We are legally mandated to close them according to the emissions compliance certifications that we have as well. So I don't see these next 6 power stations getting extended any further than they have. They've already had a 15-20-year life extension each beyond their design life. So we've got confirmation that until 2030, these power stations are actually coming offline indeed. And so basically, we also received a whole bunch of new information on why the load shedding is going so bad in the year. So some quick key takeaways of why the load shedding broke out last year is Kusile, our newest power station, had pretty much half of the power station capacity unable to produce power because the chimney failed. That's providing the exit gas for unit 1, 2, and 3. Our generating capacity is down, and that's not going to change for the next 1.5 to 2 years. There's also a Mudibi Unit 4 explosion, also 1.5 to 2 years to get that up and running. We saw a radically declining energy availability factor to under 55% during the year at all of the power stations that have been run really hard in the last 15 years. And we got the very sad news that there's grid capacity constraints. And this is the CSR that highlighted this, saying that we don't actually have capacity to put wind power onto the grid from the south of the country to supply the north of the country. And they predicted 10 years of load shedding. And this same reason led to the IPP bid windows 5 and 6 failing by 50% of their capacity in terms of the capacity that was planned for what could come onto the grid. They're only able to get half because of grid constraints. There's also a lack of proper incentivization in the private sector because we don't know what the price of electricity is going to be in 3 years. How can you capitalize a project over 20, 25, 30 years and kind of project your financial returns when you don't even know what the price of electricity is going to be in 3 years' time? And that should have been something that should have been sorted out long ago by the unbundling of Eskom and democratization of the energy sector, which was outlined by the government, the ANC government, in 1998 in their energy policy of South Africa as a medium-term goal. And we've actually seen the opposite direction of that being the case with the ANC government since then, in terms of securing and further securing the monopoly of Eskom, unfortunately. So this led me to change my projections, this new information using Bayesian thinking. And I updated my projection to saying that load shedding is projected to double over the next 5 years. And what I mean by this is that we're not going to see any reprieve, and the breakout year that we had last year, from that base, we're going to see a doubling of the overall load shedding that's taking place. So I do not see this load shedding reducing within the next 5 years. I see this this year being a 50% increase from last year. And Eskom had said themselves that they project for 2 years there's going to be load shedding continuously on an indefinite basis. With depending what decisions we make now and what's announced today, we'll see a curtailing of the load shedding increasing, and then we'll see a topping out, hopefully, in 5 years' time. I'm sticking to 5 years because it very much depends on the decisions we make now. And one business case of a good decision we can make comes from Vietnam, also a third world country, where they were able to increase their supply onto the grid by 9,000 megawatts, by 9 stages of load shedding in 6 months, by merely incentivizing their people, the residents and the business owners, to get solar by confirming a solar feed-in tariff for 20 years, something impossible in South Africa over the next 3 years. We cannot do this because we cannot confirm the price of electricity. So within 6 months, they eradicated 9 stages of load shedding relative to South Africa's load shedding, just by incentivizing through a tariff, which means they put no money down and they only give money to the citizens as they earn money for the power that they're selling. So this is one potential solution. I know there's other many, and I very much agree with my esteemed colleague Seppo in terms of the way forward is to try and get the cheapest power we can that's consistent, that does include carbon emitting technologies in the mix if you go that route. But this is one potential solution. Cool. Thank you very much.
Matthew, thank you for that. There was a request to ask whether we are going to share your slides, and I'm assuming that the answer is yes, since you presented them. So colleagues, we will make them available in a PDF download link. I'm going to trust my colleague Sibongile to sort that out for us. But excellent presentation. And if you want to take the slide off the screen so I can see your face, that would be brilliant. Cool. What I loved about the 2 introductory comments from Seppo and Matthew is Seppo went big, history, background, the overall system, energy security, and Matthew took us into the micro minutiae of load shedding, which irritates all of us and messes up with our day. And sort of between those 2 introductions, we're beginning to paint a picture of exactly what's going on. Now, I want to get into some of the details for 2 reasons. One of them is because there might be people on the forum that are not energy experts, and they say, well, what's the difference between a price signal and an energy mix and a policy choice and all the rest of it? And there might be people that are on the call that are energy experts, and they're having debates about very specific technical issues, such as the availability ratio of plants and the megawatt output of our system. And so we want to discuss this in a way that can make sense to the non-energy experts, but also be sensible to the energy experts. So maybe a place for me to start is to ask this question, and this is a quick fire question for Tsepo and Matthew. In the last decade, has the quantum of energy that we produce from coal increased or decreased? What's your perspective on that? Are we making more power from coal or less power from coal in the last decade? It's obviously not a trick question. You want to go for it, Matthew? Your take?
That's an interesting question. I would love to do an answer on that, but I'd say from my gut feel, I would say overall we've had a decrease because we've only had 2 power stations coming online, and they're really not coming online well. Yeah, so I'd say we've had a decrease because the EAF outweighs what's come onto the grid.
Your take, Tsepo, you agree with that assessment, or you want to go do your homework?
No, we have decreased. Look, in 2013, 2014, already we had 10,000 megawatts that was shut down, and that they term in breakdown. And today that figure stands between 15 and 16,000 megawatts. We've just actually breached the 16,000 megawatts of capacity that we have mothballed. And but also take this into account. In 2015, the average demand of power in the country was 34,000 megawatts. Today, we are sitting at about 29,000 megawatts. So what we saw happen is that demand effectively shifted. Demand that would have been met by Eskom has shifted. There's about 5,000 megawatts that has shifted. My assessment, based on really the situation at hand, is that over the next 12 to 18 months, there will be another 5,000 megawatts that would have been met by Eskom that is just going to migrate. And as it migrates, it unfortunately spells more financial straits for Eskom, which is failing to sell electricity. 200 days of load shedding just tells you the extent to which the revenue losses to Eskom are. So it's not a pretty picture at all.
So Tsepo, the reason I asked that question about coal, the quantum of energy production from coal, is a leading question, because I want us to talk first at the national strategic level, and then we'll come down to the sort of industry energy system level, and then we'll come down to the level of, say, what are the policy choices for South Africa? How do we get out of this mess, right? So at the national strategy level, you mentioned Hendrik van der Bijl, the guy that Van der Bijl Park was named after. He was an industrialist. He built Eskom as well as Iscor. He helped the state-owned enterprises build this very powerful engine to produce cheap coal-fired power to create a competitive energy supply in South Africa. And that, of course, set South Africa on a very particular pathway. Now, it seems to me that we're in a moment where we're having to make a really important strategic choice between, are we going to be a coal-fired power country, or are we going to be something else? Now, something else could be a diverse energy mix with renewables, with nuclear, with gas, with hydro, other energy sources, or are we going to be something in the middle, right? And how do we manage that transition? Now, when I ask the question, have we produced more or less energy from coal? The subsequent question from that is, why are we producing less and less energy? What is happening? So to a person who knows nothing about electricity in South Africa, what is happening to the infrastructure in South Africa's energy system? Over the last 15 years, Tsepo, if you walked into an Eskom plant, or from Eskom head office, traveled around the country from plant to plant to plant, what's the story on the ground?
Look, very briefly, what we've seen happen over the many years, the white paper that is sometimes referred to, it was projecting that by the year 2020, the energy demand, electricity demand in South Africa will be around 60,000 megawatts. But that actually was an erroneous assumption on the following basis. We know during the President Thabo Mbeki years, we had economic growth that was between 4 and 5%, but is referred to as the jobless GDP growth. And that jobless GDP growth in turn tells you that already there was a decline in demand. When you look at the farming or agricultural output, there's a decrease, there's a decline in demand. We look at the mining sector, you look at the beneficiation, smelters, the number of smelters that we have. So all the energy intensive users, we have seen a sustained decrease or decline in demand. At the same time, the electricity tariffs that have been actually increasing at such a rate that in the last 10 years, we have seen well over 753% compounded tariff increases. It led to a point whereby the equilibrium in terms of pricing has now been breached. So it's no longer feasible to actually, if you are a light current user, it is no longer viable to have grid power because it is so much more expensive. So we are seeing people actually now migrating to the renewables off grid, which in turn gives them that.
I'm going to come in there. I'm going to come in there. You're doing a really good job at describing what we would call the demand side, right? The national demand and the cost of that demand and the way the tariffs are affecting that demand, which is very important. And we have to cover that. But Matthew, I want to come to you back to this question. On the supply side, the actual infrastructure. So energy is an engineering problem, right? You build a thing that burns a thing and that makes energy as a consequence. At that engineering level, your perspective, Matthew, on the infrastructure story?
Great. So I fortunately had the privilege of doing that exact activity of traveling around to different power stations to see what's going on with them and trying to figure out how we can improve the energy availability factor. I also had the privilege of being in the office that was giving those same power stations the instruction for a solid 5 years to do everything they possibly can to delay maintenance, to not go on to general outage when they're meant to, because they need to avoid load shedding at all costs. And that was the mandate that was given out to the power stations that they have to comply to, of do not maintain as much as possible, stay on the grid, and actually give us 100 to 105% of your capacity, because there is a kind of 10% leeway that you can go above the rated capacity for with generators. And you want to run them usually at about 90%, but they were told to run at a minimum of 100% generation capacity or 105% if possible. So I saw
So Matthew, if I could interject there, and I don't want to be rude and interrupt your chain of thought, but this is such an important point. What I'm hearing you say is we have an old Volkswagen Beetle called the energy system in South Africa. What you're saying is we made the decision to rev that engine at 110, 150% capacity to keep the engine going. Now, if that engine contains a bit of coal-fired power stations, a bit of gas, a bit of diesel, a bit of hydro, it seems to me that we were running a bit of a risk in making that decision. What have been the consequences all? First of all, why did we choose that? You're saying, as you said, don't maintain the equipment, run the equipment. Why did we choose that, and what have been the consequences?
So it's interesting that not a lot of people understand that Eskom doesn't just make decisions by itself, and it's interesting to see Eskom being blamed by the ANC government in the media. But the ANC government literally tells Eskom what it should do and what it should not do. So Eskom follows the exact mandates as laid out by the ANC government. And one example is they were told, Eskom applied to build power stations from the year 2000 to 2007 and told every single year, no, you're not allowed to use your own money to build power stations. So the mandate came from government, from the ANC government, to run the power stations because they were so afraid of the effects of load shedding on their reputation. And it's happened that continuously, any load shedding that took place would look very bad for the country. So they said, do everything in your power to continuously not load shed. And unfortunately, that looked like things that looked a lot like moving out schedules, moving out general overhauls, running assets until failure, especially at the older power stations that are going offline, and lack of proper maintenance planning. So that's the one aspect in terms of like running it, at the Beetle engine, as you said, at top speed. The other aspect that I'd like to chat about in terms of maintenance, and the reason why we have this current energy availability factor that's terrible in the power stations, is the distinct lack of urgency and attention by Eskom and the staff on the ground at the power stations. So what I mean by that is I personally saw examples where a general overhaul would start, and then now the unit would be off for 6 to 9 months, and the whole bunch of things were meant to happen at the power station. And at the point of the unit going offline, then they started planning on what is actually the maintenance schedule and the project management schedule for what we'll do each day, when that should have been done a year before the general overhaul started. So not only that, they also then do things like cannibalize the units by taking, while the unit's offline, taking spares from the unit and using it on other generating units to try and keep them running and up and running, to follow the same mandate of no load.
So Matthew, I want to come in there partly because I want to redirect the conversation, and partly because I'd run the risk of getting so depressed at the cannibalization of units for other units that I might fall over. But let me say a couple of things and then come back to Tsepo here. So first of all, let's be fair. The apartheid government built an energy system for whites. They were very clever using coal to make cheap energy, using it with steel and iron ore as a state-owned enterprise to drive competitive energy prices that are very low. But let's be honest, they piped that energy to the white suburbs and the white business community. They didn't give it to the black majority. So we have to give the ANC their dues that when they came to power, as Tsepo was saying, energy sovereignty or energy security is energy sovereignty. It's a societal issue. They extended energy access to numbers and millions of people in South Africa that today have access to the grid. But of course, the pipes that were built, I say pipes, I mean wires, the wires that were built were never meant, they were never built with that in mind. So we started to sort of add legs to the octopus called the South African energy grid. And some of those legs weren't added by government. They were added by communities themselves, right? In a desperate attempt to get energy. And so we've had these old power stations, poorly maintained, overrun, and losing their capability, their availability factor going down, down, down. Now, in the process of that, I'm told that when government wanted to build, you couldn't build a power station in South Africa because the private sector couldn't make any money on energy. It was too cheap. And by the time that changed, by the time the tariffs went up and government started to build, we were left with Medupi and Kusile, overrun on costs, poorly built, and now we're starting to see the breakages of that. Now, this brings me to Tsepo, to the question, Tsepo. In your opening, you were arguing quite strongly for a very pragmatic energy mix. We have the coal, we should burn the coal, and you were I was quite surprised. You were basically saying, don't put intermittent energy onto our grid. Now, I differ with that quite strongly, and I want to explore that, but I want to give you a fair chance to make that case. Why should South Africa burn its coal to keep the lights on? What's your argument for that?
Well, maybe let me address the issue of, well, you know, the Nationalist Party apartheid era government, were they correct? I think the ANC government actually has got no excuse, because it is none other than Oliver Reginald Tambo, the longest serving president of the ANC, who reminded ANC people that we should learn to tell the truth to ourselves, even if the truth is the same position held by the enemy. So what is the truth? The Nationalist Party apartheid era government built a very robust infrastructure backbone for this economy to be able to function. Had they not built that backbone, but particularly in terms of our grid, that today I think is where somewhere between 33 and 34,000 kilometers of the transmission grid, had they not built that, we would not have been having well over 385,000 kilometers of the distribution grid. We would not have achieved universal access as has been envisaged in the Eskom Conversion Act of 2001. So there were very good decisions that were made, but here is the issue. When it comes to Kusile and Medupi, they should never have been constructed, those two power stations. They were built for one reason and one reason only: rampant corruption and looting. And I'm happy to discuss that with whoever that cares. But here is the issue. We should have taken a decision to install exactly the same boiler system that is in Matimba power station, instead of trying something new that doesn't have operating procedures. But that is, water under the bridge, unfortunately, the higher cost, and we're gonna have no other choice but to have to effectively abandon costs on those two power stations, because they require additional 100 billion rand in order to bring into commissioning. Now, where are we now? And what does the future look like? The future says that if we are to embrace, which we must, intermittent energy sources, we now know from case studies where we've benchmarked with whether it's California, Texas, where Australia, the UK, Spain, Portugal, any of those, or Germany, we know that the most efficient way of deploying intermittent energy sources will be off-grid, because South Africa doesn't have gas. So when you've got a baseload fleet that is coal-fired, it doesn't give you the flexibility to ramp up or down. But at the same time, using the analogy of a VW Beetle, is that VW Beetle, which is the ordinary boiler of an Eskom power station, we actually have to retrofit a Porsche engine into it. So it can then perform at a much higher level. And what do I mean by that? Retrofitting new technologies. For example, the circulating fluidized bed boiler technology would instantly give us the benefits of cost, will give us the benefits of flexibility of fuel, will give us the environmental advantages of using the discard coal that is currently polluting the environment in Mpumalanga, and at the same time will then give us that higher energy availability factor, but yet reducing our emission, our greenhouse emissions by at least 2/3, and the particulate emissions by 90%. That would be the best way to go, but you have to have a combination. It can't be, one or nothing else. It must be a combination. And in terms of deploying intermittent energy sources, I'm strongly advocating that if we go off grid with those technologies, it will give us the reliability in terms of supply, and it will ensure that we tailor the use so that our energy intensive industries can continue to rely. Right now, we have the platinum mining sector that is reluctant to send men and machine underground because they are anticipating the total collapse of the grid. That is catastrophic. So it's not only the American government that has issued an advisory, the platinum mining sector is very keenly aware that we are now at a precipice, but even the insurers have just now come up and say, hold on a second, we are not going to insure the loss from a total collapse of the grid. So it then tells us that we have to really ensure that we employ pragmatic, appropriate, but effective solutions to the problem that is facing us. Because if we are to go by what
Tsepo, I want to come in there.
In the next 5 years, there will be no grid whatsoever to speak of.
I want to come in there, and I'm going to ask Matthew to be patient if you don't mind, Matthew. I'm going to stay with Tsepo for a minute. Minister of Energy, Tsepo Kadama, coming up with what do you call it? A pragmatic, workable, affordable, secure. I'm liking the things I'm hearing. Now, I want to talk for a second about what is the obstacle. So your suggestion of decoupling baseload demand for high energy users from alternative intermittent sources and creating a really what would be a resilient, ambidextrous energy system sounds like Jesus returning and fixing our energy problems. It seems to me we have the technology, we have the know-how, we have the need, the burning platform, but it also seems to me that the decision makers, either in the Department of Energy or in the presidency or in the private sector, either don't have the will or the agreement or the alignment. What is your diagnosis of why this problem is not getting fixed?
Well, very briefly, I'll say the following. When you've got policymakers who don't know the difference and relationship between electricity and energy, there can be no hope for you. When they don't know the difference between a megawatt and a megawatt hour and the relationship, or even voltage and current, because then they don't even get to understand the current system architecture of electricity and energy in the country. So that's really, I think, our problem is that that crisis is man-made. But that is good news because it means it can be fixed, it can be resolved.
Tsepo, I love that answer. It sounded like an answer in a parliamentary portfolio committee. It was such a quality answer. Matthew, I want to come to you. Looking ahead, right? We can dissect the problem. We can blame the politicians and the policymakers. At the end of the day, as South Africans, we want the lights to be on. We want the factories to run. We want the jobs to be created. What is the to-do list on the desk of the CEOs and the policymakers? If we got around the table as South Africans, we said, we're serious about fixing the problem, we want to do it quickly, what does that to-do list look like? Where do we start?
Sure, the to-do list. I think I would like to comment on the previous commentary just quickly that my esteemed colleague Tsepo provided, and I'm very much in agreement with pretty much everything that he's saying. We divert slightly in terms of the solution going forward of coal. I mean, I think it would be lovely to be able to put clean coal onto the grid, but there just seems to be so much political will against that in the opposite direction. And in terms of why I feel we're not seeing progress is we did get a look behind the veil in terms of what the ANC government is thinking and planning in their Just Energy Transition Investment Plan that they released at COP27. And in that investment plan, they outlined that we need 1.5 trillion rand over the next 5 years flowing into the energy sector, not from them, flowing into the energy sector, with 500 billion allocated for generation capacity. And when you look at what the breakdown of the generation capacity is, there's zero investment into things like small modular reactors, nuclear. There's zero investment in anything like gas. There's zero investment in anything like clean coal, gasification, nothing. You see 95% of that money, and sorry, I get very passionate about this, 95% is split exclusively for solar, which has an opposite generating curve to the country than the country's demand, which is the peak demand in the evening and the morning, and wind, which is completely intermittent and has an average capacity generation of 20% average across each week, month, and year that is deployed. So we get an idea about where the focus is, and we're not going to speculate and make accusations about which company in South Africa is involved in half of all of the green energy projects, being Africa Rainbow Energy, being the brother-in-law who is the owner to the president. We're not going to, there's no need to like speculate or things like that in terms of where do the interests lie in the ANC government, but we can definitely see that there's a lack of understanding of what actually is needed in order to resolve this crisis. And on that note, what is needed to resolve the crisis? There's basically, the way I see it, we need to get generation capacity onto the grid as quickly as possible. We may differ in terms of exactly what generation. I think all forms of generation capacity should be incentivized to be on the grid as soon as possible. So that looks like starting with legislature and starting with the opening up of the energy sector to the private industry, because still at this moment, it's very difficult to put power onto the grid as a private power producer, especially when you don't know what the power of what the price of electricity is going to be. So what you're doing is you're getting capital from overseas, from Europe and America, to put down these solar and wind assets. That seems to be what's really incentivized by the ANC government, and that capital is like coming with a lot of strings attached, because it cannot be pegged to the generation capacity's ability to earn money. It's concessional loans. It's like 5% grants of the 9.5 billion. It's not paired with anything that you would expect to see in the private sector. And I represent the private sector, so I know that.
Matthew, I want to come in there, not because I want to interrupt you. I want to go back over some of what you've said and clarify some of it with you for those who are not energy people, right? So you're talking about market price signals coming from the market, but you're also saying, so if I describe this to a 10-year-old, you're saying that there's a group of people probably sitting at the union buildings that are quite strongly arguing for what they call a just transition, an accelerated move towards renewables, decarbonization. We do have the sun, we do have the wind. There's a good argument to make to invest in that production. But that production needs to be linked to the demand for that energy and the question of who is willing to pay and how much. Just help us understand, what is a market signal or a price signal? If you're a business leader sitting at a desk deciding whether to invest in the energy sector or not in South Africa, how do you look at that problem? What are the things you're thinking about?
How do you look at the problem? Well, as a business leader, you would need to be someone akin to Elon Musk that's very happy to take on extreme risk in the face of obvious gain and obvious opportunity that's very difficult to be quantified, because you would have to be a business leader that's willing to step in and solve an obvious problem in a sector that's going to be the biggest sector for the next 15 years, which is the energy supply sector, and be willing to take the first step and move forward. And commit capital when you do not have guarantees, or you have very low ability to confirm what the return on investment will be of that capital that you're investing. You know it's going to be something, you know it's going to be something good, but unless you can actually put a number to it, you'll find it very difficult to finance that capital, especially when you take it to the finance people. So, you know, finance people, apology, you know, if that's a graphing issue, but risk is very much not preferred in the finance world.
So what I take from that, and I think this is so important, we are at GIBS today at a business school, so let's talk about the business perspective for a second. What you're saying, and maybe this is something politicians and government bureaucrats need to hear, is that the business decision starts from identifying the opportunity, identifying the return on investment, which makes the financial case for that investment. And so if the group that you were saying have this vision of 1-point-something trillion flowing into the energy sector, if that's what they want to see, they have to create the conditions that is going to let the market react to that opportunity. Now, Tsepo, this brings us to the question of policy. Clearly from your comments, you've read widely, you're on top of it, you have a sense of policy. I see there's debates about the 2019 energy mix or the integrated energy resource plan. There's a tussle between the presidency versus the Department of Energy about the direction we should take. What is your policy prescription for South Africa? What should we be saying from the side of government to the rest of the ecosystem?
Look, in the first instance, I think the president would do well if tonight he was to announce in his State of the Nation address that South Africa will defer the implementation of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan by at least 10 years. A number of things. Also, I'm very interested to note that it's been priced at an exchange rate of 15 rand 10 cents to the dollar. And the long range, if I look at it, we're going to soon be at 20 to 1. So it means it's a 2 trillion rand plan over 5 years, but we're not going to be able to derive any usable megawatt hours that can be able to help our economy to grow. But this is what actually last year was a turning point, because in an attempt to decisively respond to the crisis that is facing our nation, the president effectively liberalized and deregulated the electricity generation sector when he announced or pronounced that up to 100 megawatts of self-generation, there is no requirement for NERSA licensing, which in turn means that the regulation has fallen by the wayside. And at the same time, we saw the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy demanding from any of the new would-be bidders that they must come in lower at bid prices of around 47 cents a kilowatt hour. When you take into account where now we are in terms of tariffs, the outlook is that from April, the tariff minimum will be 2.23 rand a kilowatt hour. So what we are going to see from that deregulation and liberalization of the electricity sector is that more people are going to migrate off grid, still use the same renewable energy capacity, but be able to earn more than what government would pay them. So effectively, I think that of saying I'm going to be on the grid is out of the window. It's no longer financially viable. And I would be very surprised if any of the banking institutions will be willing to fund to the extent that they did with bid windows 1, 2, 3, and 3.5, where the average tariff is around, or the average price to Eskom at the switchyard is 2.28 rand thereabout. So I'm seeing a situation whereby effectively more power or more demand will go off grid and still embrace the renewables. But what do we do to ensure that we therefore don't have the untimely demise of Eskom's base load, because that would be economically catastrophic, particularly for the energy intensive users.
So Tsepo, let me unpack some of that with you. And Matthew, feel free to come in on some of this. So it seems to me there's an elephant in the room, and the elephant is the shape of the government. So we have an energy system that was built at a time where there was a certain paradigm, certain mindset, which said, we have cheap coal, we have some water in some parts of the country, we can use that to create these coal-fired power stations, And we've done that fairly successfully to industrialize the country. But at the time, under that apartheid government, the mentality was a state-led development model. For all the talk about capitalism in South Africa, actually, apartheid was a socialist experiment for whites that responded to the market in a capitalist way by creating industries and businesses. But at the core of that capitalist system was really a state-led development model. Now, that state-led development model, the SOEs, which is that if we evaluate its performance, seems to be at best weak at running large institutions that require sophisticated engineering and management, right? And that's not a political statement. It's a statement about PRASA. Wherever you look, the post office, the things are falling over. And so the question that this brings me to is, you're describing a world where we should continue to feed this elephant called the state-centered energy production model. And the reason we should continue to feed it is because it is the way in which we can sustain our baseload. It's the way in which we can continue to provide energy to our core industries. Now, at the same time, what you're saying to me, if I'm hearing you correctly, is that industry is so desperate and its trust in government's capability has fallen so low that it is now beginning to adopt renewable and alternative energy sources by itself. I saw an article this morning, a headline that said the largest renewable energy plant in South Africa will fund a coal mine, which is the greatest irony, right? So that a coal miner is looking to renewable energy to dig the coal that government's going to buy from it. And so let me put this question to you. It's a bit of a provocation. Is it not the case that the state-led development model's wheels are coming off and that they will continue to come off because of the politics of the situation, and that the best hope for South Africa is not, in fact, a state-led just transition towards a diversified energy sector, but that actually South Africans, like I've done in my private home, private businesses are doing, that South Africans democratize our energy system and move away from a center, renewable energy, wind, solar, small-scale nuclear, bio, and other sources of energy. What do you say in response to that argument?
So you're asking me?
I see Matthew shaking his head, but I'm going to be nice to him and let him hold on and think for a minute. You go ahead, Tsepo.
Okay. Look, I think in terms of small modular nuclear reactors, I think we are some time away, because in terms of the national nuclear regulator in the country, we need to have a reference site, and those ones, the SMRs, are now not yet as proliferate as they could have been. So I think we are some time away. On the other hand, nuclear is got an ingredient of time from the various licensing and regulatory approvals. The Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna has a say. The Americans are going to have a say. So we're going to be some time away before we can be able to achieve that. So where are we? When you look in terms of the options that are available to us as a nation, we don't really have the option of gas because we haven't even built the infrastructure to receive any gas imports. And therefore, we have not even answered the question of, well, at what cost a gigajoule, or at what cost eventually will a megawatt hour come to, in terms of what really we need to do. And on the other hand, burning of diesel is not an option. I mean, diesel, the OCGTs are burning diesel at the cost of about 50 cents US per kilowatt hour. That brings you to well over 8.55 cents. So even in the very immediate, urgent term, it is not a solution for us. But the migration, which I'm referring to, has arisen as a direct result of that, what I would say, policy schizophrenia, where we say one thing today, 2 days later we say, I mean, if you listen to the Minister of Public Enterprise, you listen to the President, you listen to the Minister of Energy, and you listen to the Portfolio Committee, and you listen to ESCOM management and the board, you'll be very surprised that they are talking about the same entity, but their responses are diametrically opposed. And that itself has brought in a lot of uncertainty. But from that uncertainty, industry as well as households have had to find alternatives. And those alternatives, as I say, just think about it. In the last 8 years, 5,000 megawatts has migrated, notwithstanding the other decline where we have shut down. 4 of the 6 oil refineries in the country have shut down. So that itself has taken demand from the system. You look at the number of smelters that have had to shut down. So most energy intensive users also have unfortunately exacerbated what is a problem. But ordinarily one would have thought under these circumstances, it gave Eskom a unique opportunity to be able to stabilize and improve the efficiencies. But unfortunately, because of that interference that my esteemed colleague there, Matthew, is referring to, whereby the politicians unlawfully interfere, unfortunately, it means that it's going to be a difficult 5 years going forward. All of us, let us not hope for the best, but let us prepare for the worst.
So I want to pick up on that, right? So as you may know, I'm a scenario planner. We've done some scenarios on the future of energy in South Africa. They're not all bad. There are some interesting and positive highlights. One quick granular point, north of South Africa on the African continent, there are about 750 million people, just under 1 billion people who live in energy poverty. They have no electricity. They don't have load shedding because there's nothing to shed. There's no load. They live in absolute energy poverty. That number will go to 1.5 billion in the next 25 to 30 years. The consequence of that is somebody in Africa is going to give electricity to that 1.5 billion in a best case scenario for Africa. And that someone could be South Africa. If we woke up and realized actually the strategic problem in South Africa is not how to stop load shedding, it's how to use the economy we have to give energy and other value to this amazing continent north of the border. And so there are positive scenarios, but I want to take a minute to explore the worst case scenario. We do live in reality, and we have to think about this. You mentioned the Platinum Belt being worried about this. The last time that we had a serious conversation about a national blackout, one of the concerns was that you need energy to start the grid. You can't start the grid in isolation. So when I think it was Italy who had a national blackout, France and Germany lent them some electricity to start their power stations to start up the national grid. And in South Africa, our neighbors have small not skeletons, but energy supply. So Matthew, do you have a view on how this worst case scenario might play out? Is this something that is seriously being thought about? Where are we with that?
So yeah, unfortunately, the worst case scenario in my mind is going to be closer to what we experience than the best case scenario, unfortunately. And one comment about the market opportunity, I actually see it more going towards the rising of city-states that are sitting on smart grids that are deployed independently of other national grids. That will be what ends up being the trend across Africa. City-states with a smart grid disconnects from all other grids, providing power for the people that choose to come to city-states and then dwell within the state. So that's where I see things going towards smart grids being the solution, because as we're seeing with solar, even paired with battery now, you get a really cheap production. Even though it's middle of the day, most businesses are running during the middle of the day, and you can actually, without even battery, you can get to a point where you're surviving from solar alone, like they do on the moon when they go there. So yeah, I see city-states being the solution, rather than us like getting to a point where we're so abundant with energy, we're sending it. I mean, that'd be lovely, that'd be great. I really hope it goes that direction. But I definitely see within the next 5 years, it's going to go much more towards the worst possible scenario. And in my mind, it's you can say that there's going to be a national blackout, but I really don't think that's going to happen. I really don't think that's going to happen. And the reason being is that we do have a really good methodology in place for this load shedding process that we go through. Whereas the load is increasing and we're not able to meet it, then they cut each stage of load shedding, and we have up till stage 8 at the moment. So one thing that I see Cyril announcing tonight, just as an aside, is the unbundling of Eskom and the legal separation of transmissions so that other companies can start providing power. But I also see within the next few weeks the updating of the stage of load shedding up to stage 12 even. Because what will happen is as we start not being able to meet the grid, we'll go all the way up to stage 20, and then they'll just disconnect whatever load is on the grid from the grid, just to keep the power lines charged and keep the power stations keeping each other alive, so that the frequency at least can be maintained in the country. So we fortunately do have a black start capability, so we can start up over a 2-week process with diesel generators at some of our power stations. But I don't see us getting to that
Just
place.
to check, Matthew, did you say we can start up over a 2-week process using our diesel generators? Did I catch that right?
Unfortunately, yes. And just to be clear, I do not see that happening. That is a situation if we have something like happened in the 70s, a solar flare that just completely wipes out our grid and trips everything at once, trips all the substations, trips all the power stations to island, and be even disconnect and shut down. Then we have the capacity in the country to do a black start, because we have diesel generators that can start off one generating unit. That one generating unit will then start up the next 2, 3. The power stations will island, providing itself power, and then give the next power station closest to it power to start up the first generating unit. Once all power stations in the country have gotten to a point where they're all up and running and relatively safe, then we'll start feeding more power onto the grid. And so that's why it's a 2-week process if we do blackouts.
So Matthew, thank you for that. Just to paint a bit of color into that picture, the other system, like our energy system that was built for some at the exclusion of others, the other one that's like that is, of course, the water system, which is a bulk water transfer system, which relies on electricity to pump the water into cities that don't have big rivers or dams. Unlike many other major cities in the world, the likes of Joburg is not built next to a big water source. The consequence of which is that the water system is dependent on the energy system to function. And not only is the water system dependent, but the sewage system is dependent. So if I think about your picture, where it takes us 2 weeks to get the diesel running, to get the powered lines charged, to get the energy up, what that tells me is we have a scenario where we're in deep, deep trouble in that particular situation. And Tsepo, this seems to me like if we think that July last year in KZN, the riots there were, or the unrest, the looting, the unhappiness, the desperation, if you think that was bad, it seems to me that a national blackout would be an absolute catastrophe for South Africa. Do we have the energy and the urgency and the leadership in government right now to deal with this problem, to steer us away from that worst case scenario? What are the actions that we should be looking for to show that they get it and they're working on it?
Well, I mean, in the first instance, look, the security forces in the country, by their own admission, and they should have briefed the president on this, they have got no more than 3 days of resources to keep, law and order in the country. Once there's a total collapse of the grid, there's going to be panic, and the population has not been prepared as to what to expect, how therefore to act and conduct themselves in the time of a total collapse of the grid. That is a disaster. But also, as you increase the stages of load shedding above the stage 8, the risk that you then sit with is that of theft and vandalism, because right now we've given the organized criminal gangs a schedule to say, look, over the next 24 months, you can prepare yourself as to where to go and harvest copper at no cost to yourself. So that is a worry. I mean, we can't, that is not remote, by the way. We saw this happen during COVID, that PRASA and Transnet infrastructure was completely plundered and harvested by the organized criminal gangs. You can go from Musina all the way to Cape Town. You now have to run a diesel locomotive. You can't even run an electric train. And also you can look at the numbers from Transnet in terms of the volumes of cargo that they used to handle, because they are, electric locomotives can no longer run on some of the lines and the main lines. So it is a very, very difficult situation. In fact, there should be no reason for us to prepare even for stage 8 or 10 or 12. we've got within us that within a period of 90 days, we can be able to return to service enough capacity at above 60% energy availability factor, and therefore reduce, but also be able to allow for certainty, particularly for industry. Because right now, there's effectively an investment moratorium resultant from the energy insecurity, and that is just compounding our problems and more so putting Eskom itself in a dire financial state. I mean, if you look at the financials of Eskom, this coming financial year, March 2023, they're going to have to impair at least 35 billion rand of municipal debt. They're going to have to impair, in terms of long-lived assets, the 15,000 megawatts that they have. So the balance sheet of Eskom is going to be decimated when the auditors have to apply the rules as written. It is actually we are in a crisis that demands decisive but appropriate action. And I have got very little faith that the current administration has got the capacity to do so. I mean, last year, July, when they established the war room called National Electricity Crisis Committee, we were sitting at about 58% energy availability factor. By December, we had dropped to 49. And hence, we are in this crisis that we are in. And as more and more of the plant is taken offline, as more and more of it breaks down, because there doesn't seem to be management that understands. For example, the CEO who is to come, I advocate that CEO must be interviewed through a public interview process where the winning candidate must have presented a plan that can show that within a period of 90 days, load shedding becomes a thing of the past by just employing and utilizing the resources that they have, and at the same time ensure that they don't incur more debt, they don't misspend, because I categorize spending an additional 100 billion rand to commission Medupi and Kusile as a misspend.
So Tshepo, just for a second here, on a lighter note, talking about 20 levels of load shedding, I'm told after level 14, Eskom has a team that will come to your house to put out the candle at night before you go to sleep. Maybe this is what we do as South Africans. We make jokes so that we can survive level 2, level 3, level 4. And that's how we cope. But you're making a very serious point that actually we need a plan, we need a person, and we need someone who can execute on that plan. But there's another piece of the puzzle that you're mentioning, which is we need the public to hold that person or that plan accountable for what they say they are able to do and what they're actually doing. And so this raises the question for me, Matthew. We can talk about the technology and the energy mix and the infrastructure, but at the end of the day, what is the mechanism? So if the change we need is not going to come from the bureaucrats, it has to come from somewhere. If you had to imagine with me for a minute, what could that process look like? In other words, who needs to get in a room with who? What should they be talking about? What does this process of getting ourselves out of the energy crisis look like?
Sure, that's a great question. That's like, how do you solve the biggest problem that's facing South Africa for the next 15 years? Who needs to get into the room? I really do think that there needs to be a collaboration between the powers that be and this war room, as my esteemed colleague puts it, which I agree with. There needs to be collaboration between the powers that be and the private sector, and laying out realistically what will it take for the private sector to actually come in and fix this mess. And the reason why I say the private sector to come and fix this mess is, unfortunately, we have tried to the mechanism, we've pulled the lever of giving Eskom more money and making more money available. We did a 30% increase in 2010, and we've taken a look what that road looks like before of providing additional support. And unfortunately, I very much agree with my esteemed colleague Tshepo that we need to support Eskom during this time of the transition, because if we completely take away the support that Eskom has, we will see some very dark years for the next 5 years. So at the same time that Eskom is supported to be able to provide power and keep the EAF around 60%, there's different ways of doing that. Eskom supported, we also need then the ability for private sector to come in and solve this energy crisis by doing things like changing the way that the price of electricity is set in the country, so that you can have it's been done before by the government where we subsidize the cost of electricity. So we put a line in the sand and we say, okay, this is what the price of electricity is going to be set at. Similar to Philippines, it's Vietnam, where we give you a tariff that you can take to the bank for the next 20 years, so that you can actually go and then put down assets that provide energy, because you can then confirm your return on investment. And that's interestingly no money put down by the government at all. That's just showing them that showing it's government doing things to show the private sector that there will be a return on investment. And through that, then the private sector comes to the party. And I say this because the company that I'm working for, we are pretty much the private sector when it comes to partnering with the banks in South Africa. We're the only company that's partnered with all the banks to provide residential solar to the country. So we're seeing the solution coming from the private sector, at least for the individual. And there's some kind of knock-on effects that you see as you removed yourself as a load from the grid in your house, Professor. You then helped load shedding by now not needing to be supplied by the grid. You also saved Eskom money by then not needing to fire diesel to power your house. So you actually increase their overall profitability, even though technically the revenue that has gone from your house, you're helping solve load shedding, and you're helping Eskom be more profitable by your house going solar. So you see, like, from the bottom up, the private sector responding, but we want to see from the top down the private sector responding, and that requires the top people to all talk to each other.
So Matthew, thank you for that. I'm aware that we're moving towards our closing time, but there's been such great comments and questions in the chat as well. I'm going to read a handful of them, and then I'm going to give our panelists an opportunity to respond. Cabo says here, is it possible that Eskom's failure is pure sabotage? And then interestingly, Cabo doesn't blame is it the International Monetary Fund? Is it the ANC? In other words, who's the boogeyman that's breaking our energy SOE? So maybe we can have a comment on that. David says here, how about the state inviting the private sector to build new grid capacity, but providing a guarantee of certain minimum return on investment? I think that's what Matthew's talking about. So there's a case there around incentives. Karabo saying, is there a leadership vacuum with the Eskom organization? I know that they serve good coffee in Eskom. Sometimes it's a bit, it's not so good for the health, but what do we say about the leadership at Eskom? And then maybe this other one here, Etienne, why are we not incentivizing decentralized intermittent generation and storage? It's becoming financially viable. It's been demonstrated in Vietnam. And so let me start with you, Tsepo, as we start to move towards a close. Sabotage, is it a factor? Who's doing it? What else do you want to say?
Look, certainly the crisis we are in has been orchestrated, but it has been orchestrated largely because, of what I term greedy profiteering, nothing else. It's not in the quest to supply energy to the nation, which is our urgent need, energy to the nation, but it must be the least cost. So when you look at what's happening, I think my esteemed colleague there, Matthew, the company, his employer, is actually going to be one of the unicorns in terms of valuation multiples, because that's certainly the route. So if anything, we are going to see more money being poured into organizations such as the one that he works for, whereby you go off grid. Let me give you an example. I mean, in the United States alone, Solar City, which is a Elon Musk company, is installing at least 85 megawatts of off-grid renewable power every month. So that, if anything, I think is an example, or rather what we are going to see more and more happen, at least in South Africa, particularly for the more affluent. But the problem for Eskom, of course, is that, remember this, the residential customers account for 44.9% of Eskom's customer base. So as more and more move off grid, to the extent that temporarily it gives us reprieve in terms of load shedding, it also means more financial hardship. It is financially ruinous for Eskom, but perhaps maybe that's the route that we should go in order to be able to have the economy saved. But again, that uncertainty in terms of the trajectory going forward, where are we going to get baseload megawatts for the energy intensive users? It means that the event that just ended today in Cape Town called Mining Indaba, it is really going to continue to be no mines, no money, and ANC being for absolutely no current.
Thank you, Tsepo. I can see that you've read Dale Carnegie's book, How to Make Friends and Influence People, there in the ANC. But really appreciate your comments. One comment I would push back on a little bit, you said earlier that we should defer, the president should in SONA defer the just energy transition for 10 years. In some of my own work with the World Energy Council, we look at things like the border tax that the Europeans are going to implement against products manufactured on coal-based energy systems. And so one of the big dilemmas is that we can't just solve South Africa's energy problem within South Africa according to what we need or want, but we have to do it as a competitive, open economy, doing business with the rest of the world. And so it seems to me that there's this narrow path between enough transition to meet our expectations of our international stakeholders and mobilize their capital and their investment, but not so fast that we leave the baseload behind, we leave the coal miners behind, that we destabilize the system entirely. Matthew, I want to come to you with a question as we move towards a close here. It is SONA today. Hopefully, out of the 140 odd people on our call today, there's some from the public sector. If you had to give a message to those who have power in the energy system that can take action to begin to move in the right direction, what would you say to them?
Great. So the number one key point that I would like to land with my colleagues in the public sector, and I previously worked in the public sector being Eskom, is to incentivize the private sector to start helping solve the problem. And there's various ways of incentivizing. Some of the biggest ways is to provide a tariff and a reasonable tariff. As my esteemed colleague Tsepo pointed out, the tariff at the moment is not reasonable that they're proposing of 79 cents per kilowatt hour, which is the NERSA tariff. City of Cape Town is leading the charge on that by adding 25 cents to that tariff and then providing that from June for businesses. So they're leading the way in terms of how to resolve this energy crisis. So there could be lessons to be learned from places and examples that are doing and making good decisions like the City of Cape Town. So I think I'd like to see collaboration then, and also business cases done on places that have found their way out of this hole that we're in, that unfortunately I see is going to get worse, a lot worse before it gets better, as we need to go towards the unbundling and democratization of the sector. It's unfortunately the only part that I see in my entire dissertation was based on that. As Eskom too big to fail, or necessitated change? And the answer is it's unfortunately necessitated change, because we've tried the tested path of helping Eskom, trying to help Eskom by giving more money, and we see that unfortunately, as Ted Brown puts it, there's a happy coincidence, a relationship between incompetence and corruption, where the people that are making the decisions are not quite understanding the impact of those decisions in the next 5, 10, 15 years, but they are seeing the immediate benefits financially from making certain decisions. So I'd like to see them moving towards incentivizing private.
Thank you, Matthew. And Tsepo, maybe a final remark from you. This, in some ways, this takes us all the way back to the first thing that you said, which was really about the state getting its act together and Eskom succeeding. Matthew is painting a very different picture, where the private sector is the one that sort of comes to the rescue. I certainly dream of, if I can put it in a picture, I dream of young Black entrepreneurs from township backgrounds leading the energy industry as the private sector, as opposed to what's often referred to as white monopoly capital and the same old, that this can be a real revolution in job creation and opportunity generation. Your remark to those in power, maybe to those in the public sector and in the private sector, what would be your call to action?
Look, first and foremost, I wish that the president had read the book, The Symphony of Power, which is a coffee table book from ESCOM, because if he had read that book, The Symphony of Power, he would have understood from its title that it is very instructive as the type of the system architecture that is demanded for South Africa. But on the other hand, what I hope will happen is that going forward, we will see with the deregulation, the liberalization, though inadvertently passed by government, that we will see investment from the private sector, but that will be investment that is largely off-grid, because right now we pay the price of on-grid. And if anything, I think we should really see our government working a lot more closer with the World Energy Council, with the, all those multilateral institutions, because evidently right now they make no reference to what policies they are advocating for. So if you look at per capita now, I think we are sitting at 2,800 megawatt hours. You take a small country, Norway or Sweden, they are sitting at about 13,200 megawatts hours per capita. And that, as I say, for the constitution of this country to become a living document, for the dream that is promised to become a lived reality, energy security is fundamental, and electricity is going to be an absolute must if we are to say, indeed, we are a constitutional democracy based on the fundamental principles, the cardinal principles of the fundamental rights that are promised in our constitution, whether it's the right to earning a living, all the rights to everything else, the right to life is based on having energy security. And without energy security, we are going to be in a precipice. So I fear for our country, unless something drastic is done. And let's hope that from interactions such as the one that we are having today, from a very eminent academic institution that is really led by, I think, thought leaders in terms of policy making and how the economy is supposed to be structured, that maybe let's hold that dimmer of hope that the government will now listen and be attuned to what really we need to do next, because else I fear greatly that with more inequality, we are going to be insecure, and the Arab Spring is at hand unless we do something drastic.
Tsepo, wise words. I fear for the country, but keep hope alive. Reminds me of the old saying, hope is not a strategy. So we need a strategy, we need to act. And so, colleagues, let me say to our two esteemed panelists, thank you for your excellent inputs and sharing your experience with us so generously. Let me say to Sibongile and Luleka and others who've made today possible in the background, thank you for putting it together. To our participants, thank you for being with us at GIBS, always a privilege. And let me say this in closing, when they find a new ESCOM CEO, I see they're advertising for one, I hope they phone Tsepo and Matthew and 100 other bright young South Africans to fix the problem. Colleagues, thank you. Have a lovely Thursday evening. See you again soon at a GIBS forum.